Question number 7, Denise Roche.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Immigration and asks, what steps, if any, did Immigration New Zealand take to ensure validity of the visas of the 9 students currently seeking sanctuary in a church, including any interviews with these students to determine the accuracy of their application before they came to New Zealand?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Michael Woodhouse.
Mr Speaker, this may be a little longer than most primary answers. I beg your indulgence. I'm not aware of the exact numbers or identities of the individuals currently inside a church in Auckland, so my answer is in respect of the 9 Indian students, the subject of recent media, unlawfully in New Zealand and who were represented by Mr Alistair McClymont and whose requests to stay in New Zealand were declined. I'm aware 2 of those individuals have departed New Zealand voluntarily, and I understand some of the remaining 7 are amongst those inside the church. Time prevents a detailed description of each step in each application, but the steps would include an immigration officer checking that the applicant had made a declaration on the form that, amongst other statements, includes, quote, "I have provided true and correct answers to the questions in this form. I understand that if false or misleading information is submitted, my application may be declined without further warning." Another step would be to check that on the completion of the statement, quote, "I have attached evidence that I have access to sufficient funds to support myself through my intended stay." Of the 9 individuals represented by Mr McClymont, 6 were interviewed either in person or by phone to discuss their studies, and several of those students were asked directly about their financial documents. Other questions included the purpose of gaining qualifications, a test of their understanding of the tertiary institution they plan to enrol in and of New Zealand generally, and questions of the applicant's bona fides, that is, their intentions on the completion of their studies.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Denise Roche.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Why did the Minister claim on Radio New Zealand on the 3rd of February that, quote, "immigration agents will interview them, check and confirm that they understand," end quote, when Immigration New Zealand records show that 3 of the students were not interviewed and 2 other interviews were conducted with education agents posing as the students?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Michael Woodhouse.
Mr Speaker, the questioner asked about immigration agents. I presume she means immigration officers. My answer was in respect of the process generally, not exhaustively. And in respect of the 3 who were not specifically interviewed, it's not a requirement. The explanations that were given in the applications were considered to be satisfactory and consistent with what one would expect, and no interview was required. But as I said, 6 of the 9 were indeed interviewed.
Point of order.
Point of order, Denise Roche.
I'd like to table this document, sir. It contains information collated by the lawyer of the 5 students and is a summary of Immigration New Zealand records of the visa processes for all 9 students. It contains specific dates and notes about which students were interviewed as part of their visa.
The document's been well and truly described. I'll put the leave. The leave is sought to table it.
I ascertain whether or not the permission of the applicants has been granted for that private information to be released.
Can the member assist with that?
My understanding is through their lawyer, yes, it has.
I'll put the leave. It'll be for the House to decide. Leave is sought to table that particular information. Is there any objection? There is objection.
Point of supplementary.
Supplementary question, Denise Roche.
What message does it send to people who want to study and eventually settle in New Zealand that this government is more interested in the profits of education providers and immigration agents than supporting the victims of fraud?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Michael Woodhouse.
Mr Speaker, the broader message is this. There are around 125,000 student visas granted every year, and the overwhelming majority of those applicants provide applications that are true in all respects. They come here to get a world-class education, and overwhelmingly they go home satisfied with their experience. I think that is still the message that it sends.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Denise Roche.
Why is his government happy to use discretion to grant citizenship to non-resident billionaires but refuses to show compassion for students who have paid thousands of dollars of fees and who simply want to finish their education?
The Honourable Michael Woodhouse.
Well, Mr Speaker, that's probably a question best directed to the Minister of Internal Affairs, given that he or she would be granting citizenship. Well, I go back in time. I say he or she because the person, the subject of that question, was granted conditional residence in 2006 by Labor under far flimsier immigration instructions that existed at that time, including for money and time in country. That applicant did not commit fraud on either of those applications, and I think that's a significant difference.
Point of order?
Point of order.
I would like the question asked, which is about the compassion shown to students who are caught up in an...
Order. The question was well and truly addressed. It was significantly involved then with response to an interjection. It has been addressed.